Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Balls in Your Face Marketing. Today I have the distinct pleasure of speaking with a very impressive young man, wise beyond his years. He is the host of a very cool and popular podcast, Humans 2.0. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend you do. It is outstanding. In a little over a year, this young man has recorded well over 100 episodes. He has had some incredible guests, a number of writers from the New York Times, award-winning author Eric Davis, Neil Patel, Seth Godin, to name a few. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Metry.
I've got big balls. I've got big balls. They're such big balls, and they're fancy big balls. And he's got big balls, and she's got big balls. But we've got the biggest balls of them all.
Mark, welcome to Balls in Your Face. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Dude, thank you so much for having me, man. This is, first off, it's a great show, and it's hosted by an even better human. So.
Oh, thanks, man. That's too kind of you. Too kind of you. Likewise. You know, it's amazing to me. Like, you are, if I knew what you know at your age, when I was your age, my life would have been very different. I pride myself on having had a very good work ethic all my life. I love working. I had a paper route when I was 12 years old. I worked at McDonald's when I was 14 years old. I've remained on the cutting edge. I have had a very entrepreneurial spirit all my life. But to be honest, in hindsight now, comparing myself to where I'm at now, comparing myself to a young man like yourself, I realized my mindset was shit. It was. I was afraid of failure. I was afraid to ask for help. I was afraid of success. Tell me a bit about, your story.
Yeah. I mean, I think what you mentioned is it's really interesting, especially as like young guys. We'll kind of look back at our life and be like, oh, wow, we were really hustling. We were really putting it in. And that's all really coming from ego, right? So like, for example, when I was 15 years old, I kind of just stumbled onto this business idea from a video game that I loved playing. And it ended up making me hundreds of thousands of dollars. So like on the outside, financially speaking, I was pretty successful. But on the inside, my mindset was crap. It wasn't there. And I realized, some of those motives, some of those things that pushed my work ethic, they're not inherently good or bad, but they've just got to be, like fine-tuned and crafted into the trajectory that we want in life. So I'm just really so thankful that I kind of went through that at an early age. And now I'm 21 and now I'm able to see, okay, there's a lot more in life than just the money, just the business. And in fact, doing the work on your internal self will often help you in business, will often help you help other people. And I'm so unbelievably grateful I discovered this at a young age, man. Like, I can't tell you how many emails, how many messages I get from people that are like 50 years old that are like just becoming aware of this. And now they've had like all this programming that they've done to themselves in their subconscious, and it's a lot harder to start reverting those patterns versus when you're like 20 years old, for example.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. And I would really just define myself as I'm just out here. I'm trying to understand the world. I'm trying to be in a state of understanding. I'm trying to learn as much as I can about everything. If you take a look at my podcast, Humans 2.0,
Oh, we just cut off on the sound there. I don't know what happened there. Oh, yeah, you...
I accidentally muted myself.
Yeah, you accidentally muted it. That's okay. No problem.
If you look at the main topic of the podcast is growth, but I really like talking about a variety of different things. So I like talking, 14-year-olds that started an augmented reality company that's backed by Microsoft. I like talking to the 80-year-old who was fired by his corporation and then bought it back, and then now it's like an $800 million company. People in business, people in like cooking, people like just from every single field, because I think as humans, we're all kind of the same thing. Like everyone really has like that kind of human 1.0, human 2.0 story, or they're just not aware of it yet. And I just like pulling from all of these different ends because, I don't think anything's black and white. I think life's like a buffet. We should
yeah. It's funny you were mentioning the robot. I was just listening to your robotic kitchen episode. I hadn't listened to that.
Oh, yeah.
Brilliant, amazing stuff, man. And I, you know, I agree, and it's so cool to hear a young person like yourself pushing this message, because I mean, I've always kind of felt this, you know, that they're exactly like you're kind of saying, you know, money can't buy you love. Money, you know, money is not everything. And you know, I've said frequently that, you know, I've tried to kind of push back against this sort of culture of narcissism, this emphasis that we and value that we put on wealth and celebrity, and you know, and really push people to strive for lives that are meaningful, real, like, you know, what's really meaningful. And again, it sounds, you know, you're somebody at a very young age who's obviously figured that out at a very young age about what makes for a meaningful life. Why don't you tell me a bit about, because I know the story, but again, not many people do, and there's a lot about the story that I don't know. You were at a party. You know what I'm talking about. So why don't you just take over?
Yeah, sure. So, okay. So for context, so I really start to sort out my life after I go off to my first year in college. And I basically end up falling down this like depressive rut. I end up gaining like 50 pounds in just like 2-3 months, like really just like binge eating my feelings away. Wasn't doing anything productive. I would just like watch TV shows and, you know, I just waste my time basically. And the reason why is because I kind of felt this resistance in me. And when I talk to it, every single person that is talented, every single person that has a potential feels the same thing when they're not awoken to their true selves. So I was basically living my life on one track, and it wasn't the life that I actually wanted to live. So I go to my first year in college. I end up kind of spiraling down like this depressive, isolated, socially anxious rut. And I kind of end up breaking from that. I go off to the summer. I end up going back to my parents' place. I end up traveling a bit. I get a lot of perspective there. You know, I start to like really kind of like understand reality and understand the way that things move around. And I just start learning things. Like I didn't have a vision. I didn't have a dream. It was just like, I don't even know what happened, but all I know is that I don't want that again. So I just start learning. I start reading books. I start trying to learn from people. And then I start to become aware of this whole kind of, you know, healthy lifestyle, like your diet, exercise, sleep. Like before, the idea that like I impacted my life didn't exist in my head yet, which is really weird to say now. So I go off to my second year of college, and I end up picking up this new diet lifestyle called Bulletproof. I end up like losing the weight like that. I end up sleeping normally. I end up, you know, exercising normally. I end up like, you know, building good relationships with people. But there was still something missing, right? So I go to that party my sophomore year. So I'm still in kind of like the same old bad, negative thought patterns. Like I'm kind of half pregnant with like the idea of like, you know, tripling down fulfillment. And then I'm also like bullshitting, like wasting my own time away. I have both of those ideas. And I was just like, this seems wrong. Like I've removed the BS enough from my life that I'm now able to tell, quote unquote, like what the truth is. Like my internal compass is starting to point in the right way. And I'm just like, this does not feel right. The BS that I had in my life before, that was fogging up my vision, my perception, to the point where, yeah, I could, you know, binge eat the rest of my nights away. I could just waste my life away. It started to have that BS. But once I started removing that, I started to feel and hear and sense my, like, the real Mark, the real person inside of me. And I was at this party in October of 2017 or of 2016. And I was just like, this does not feel good anymore. You know, like the BS that used to keep me in a complacent state has, I've removed that from my life. So I basically just end up like leaving from this party. I end up like running back to my room, like very, very emotionally. And I'm just like, I need to change. I need to like do something different right now. You know, because if I've learned anything, it's that whenever I tell something to myself, like, oh, I'm going to do this later, or I'll do this like some other time, it never comes. So like I've learned that in order to do something, you literally have to do it right now. So this is like a like towards the end of the night. I run back to my house. I lock myself in my room. I basically just like pull out this notebook. And at that time I had learning a lot about exponential technologies and the way the future is moving. And I basically just start to like list out like literally every single industry in the technology field that I was interested in, that I thought there was potential in for me to like just put at least one foot forward. And I listed like 10, 12, 15 different industries through like a process of cross-elimination through like different research online. I end up boiling it down to virtual and augmented reality. I kind of get like this idea to start a business, horrible idea, but I was just like, I just need to do this right now. And then I kind of start this thing. It's called View Dream. Right now it does something totally different. It's still in the virtual and augmented reality space, but that was kind of my first foot in the door of like creating this business as a way, not necessarily to like grow my influence or money or things like that, which I think are very important, but just really as a way for me to kind of start my own, you know, spiritual conquest. You know, I see a lot of people that kind of fall down this personal development thing, but then they start saying things like, oh, I don't have the discipline, I don't have the motivation. But it's like when you start a business, it kind of pushes you to do those things, right? Mm-hmm. Like business doesn't ask you if you want to wake up at like 5:30 in the morning because, you know, you have clients, you have things to do, X, Y, and Z. So that was kind of my mentality of approaching it and that kind of story.
Interesting stuff. And by the way, I should tell for the audience, you know, when I saw the original version of this story, I mean, you're very brave as far as I'm concerned, you know, willingness to be vulnerable. You admitted to the fact that when you went back to your room, you were bawling.
Yeah, crying.
Bawling your eyes out, right? I mean, you know.
Yeah, and running.
Yeah.
Like on my way, yeah, it was like a very like, it was kind of like that thing in the movie where like the dude's just like crying and he's running home. Like it was kind of like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, no, it's an amazing sort of turnaround. And again, I agree with you wholeheartedly that, you know, the way that we perceive things has a very direct impact on our outcomes. When you start, you know, the more that you start to, and it's a difficult thing for people to you know, to stop those pathways in their brains. That's what happens. You know, your brain gets used to it. It almost gets addicted to that negative feeling. It gets addicted to finding excuses, externalizing all of the things that you know, the reasons why their lives are not the way that they want it to be. And the reality is it's you standing in your own way, right? That you know, you're the one with those pathways. Your pathways are kind of reinforcing, and you have to train your brain to catch them first and then rewrite them. And it's work, but it is, you know, I mean, you know, obviously you're in a much better place right now.
Oh yeah, dude. My internal 180 degrees. Like
yeah.
You should have, like a lot of people ask me like what kind of person I was before. And I'm like, just look at me now from like a mental, emotional standpoint and literally flip that around 180 degrees.
Yeah. Now, so tell me, you know, because I think, you know, there's a bit of a, you know, a depression and a suicide epidemic going on in the United States. I've kind of talked a little bit about that and sort of different theories as to why that is. One of the things that I blame, you know, is social media, social marketing, and that, again, like what I'm saying, that pushback that I've been doing against that superficial presentation of self is because I think that that's an element of it, right? When people are only presenting, you know, their smiling pictures, the trips of them on their vacations, you know, the wonderful restaurants that they're eating in and so on, everybody's lives look outstanding in comparison to your own, and it doesn't match your internal experience. So I think that's part of it. But I think you're touching on another big factor here, is again, going back to meaning, purpose. What is the meaning of our lives? And I think, you know, this is where, you know, I have an issue with just some of the sort of the messages, and in particular for young men.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's the problem. There's a problem when you have a sort of a societal message. And by the way, I mean, women, I don't mean to exclude women in this. Women, I think, also have all kinds of terrible messages, society telling them that they have to look beautiful all the time, that, you know, that a certain body type, you know, if you're X amount of weight, then there's something wrong with you, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, I think women are the ones that often do that to each other the worst. They judge each other the worst. And For a lot of years, though, I found like, this didn't impact men, although now it has started to, right? Like there has been now this message that, of, hey, it's your toxic masculinity is the problem, right?
Yeah.
That we live in this patriarchal society that holds everybody down, and that's the problem, right? That there's a problem with being a man, right?
Yeah.
And I can totally understand why, why a lot of young men feel, they don't, it's not clear. It's much different, back in, before my time, right? Back in the 50s when it was very clear, you went to school, you went and got a job, you worked for the factory for the rest of your life. They were kind of loyal to you. You were loyal to them. It gave you enough money to, buy a TV and support your family. Men had their role, women had their role. Again, not that, I'm all for the civil rights movement and women joining the workforce. I think that's all, great. I think everybody, should be able to pursue their own dreams. But in a way, I think maybe people were a little bit happy in the sense that at least there was an expectation. They knew what was expected of them. So I guess what are your words of encouragement to that younger generation? How do you kind of talked a bit about it there, but how can they find their individual meaning?
Yeah. Okay. So you said a lot of great things in there. I'm really glad you said that. So I look around the world today, and believe it or not, if you just look at the numbers, the world is getting better in every single sense of the form. Every single country's development factor is increasing. Even the countries that are like, I think I read this article in the New York Times, like the term third world countries is almost gone. It's almost, and it's slowly being eradicated.
Absolutely.
But the thing is that, 800,000 people commit suicide every year, right? If you add up those numbers, that's more than natural disasters, wars, armed conflicts. So it's really interesting to see that dynamic. I think there's a lot of different factors for sure. I think social media and the whole kind of comparison facade that us human beings have gone, I think that's definitely a factor in it. But the way that I view it mostly is this, right? 1,000 years ago, if you and I were alive, first off, we would never ever talk to each other ever, because you'd probably be somewhere in Europe or whatever. I'd be somewhere in Africa, and we'd never ever talk to each other.
Right.
Our parents or our families would probably, half of them would probably be dead because of the bubonic plague, right?
Yeah.
Yet, I mean, first off, we're young men, right? So we would be enlisted.
I'm not so young.
Dress up.
I'm in my 40s, man.
It's all right, man. You too. We dress up as a different color, and we'd go murder each other because of a king or something like that.
Yeah.
So, like, in a way, I don't even think people had time or the cognitive capacity to be depressed and anxious,
Yeah.
And like, people also didn't live that long too. So I think like the whole dynamic of us as humans is kind of changing. I also think one of the major factors is that we've separated ourselves from nature in a very short amount of time. So I think if you ask me, like, again, I'm not a scientist. I can't point out like to this specific thing, because I don't think the world is that black and white. But if you point to me and you're like, why are people killing themselves? Why are people so depressed and anxious? I think a big part of it has to do with our lifestyle, meaning like where we live, how we live, with who we live, what we're eating, how we're moving, what we're doing throughout the day. I think that's a big issue. So like for me, when I look back, growing up as a kid, a lot of my mental health issues came from my health issues, my physical health issues. I had autoimmune issues. So like when I fixed my diet, my brain started to perceive the world in a different way. And when your brain starts perceiving the world in a different way, then you start to do different things. I think there's a big thing to it. And I think what you said about young men is especially really important. Like you talked about toxic masculinity and whatnot. And that's something that, contrary to a big belief, a lot of young men are struggling with that. at a subconscious level that they don't even know about because it's coming from society, which in turn has a biological indicator within themselves that tells them there's something wrong with them, right? I'm sure you know who Dr. Jordan B. Peterson is.
Of course, yeah.
He talks a lot about this, and it comes from a lot of different things. A lot of people think it comes from this kind of like almost like bad feminists, like people that after the civil rights movement, after going for all the things that are like normal that you and I want women to have, like just like an equal human being, they kind of think the world is framed in this kind of, it's men versus women. Like throughout the entire history, the history of humanity is men oppressing women. And then, if you look at somebody like Peterson, he's like, it's actually not that simple. Like, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. If you look at history, like, for example, humans were against the bubonic plague. It wasn't men versus women. If you look at wars, it was big groups of nations or big countries versus big countries with men and women. It wasn't this necessarily men versus women kind of narrative that people like to paint on things. Obviously, that was a big issue, and there's obviously different prejudice, there's discrimination, all that sort of stuff exists. But I think young men are especially going through a time right now where things are like, it almost makes it seem like it's like if you're like a college person, like, hey, like, there's messages like, don't talk to girls, like, if you talk to this girl, she's going to think you're going to like try to molest her. And like, all like these crazy things that are like an emergence of like liberalism, like political segregation, like all these different things that people have kind of exacerbated. And I don't think it's right at all. I'm not a fan of politics in any sense of the word whatsoever, but that's for a different topic. But I mean, in terms of this kind of individuality, I think it's a big issue. What I would say is this, sort yourself out, like spend some time by yourself, kind of remove the BS. Cause I think that's what the main thing is, right? I think a lot of us, like, we start living our lives based on what our parents tell us, what our colleague at works tell us, what the TV tells you, what LinkedIn tells you, what this tells you. And it's like, you've got an internal life in there by your own that you've got to figure it out. And like a lot of people will feel this this resistance between the real you and the external world. And then what they'll do, they'll fill it up with a bunch of BS, right? Like, drinks after, and again, I'm not saying any of these things are bad. I'm just saying they can be used incorrectly. Drinks after work, watching TV so you can like shut off your unconscious, like pornography, like social media addiction. Like there's so many different things that people use to waste time and to almost like fill their life up with a bunch of crap so they can be distracted by what the real world tells them, right? And I've found like once you do take that step to like surrender, to almost submit in yourself, life changes. Like personally, I remember I would never journal anything down. Like I would never ask myself a question. Like I would never take a piece of paper out and write, Mark, what do you really want in life? Because I was literally afraid. I was literally afraid of what I would tell myself, right? Because oftentimes, like, and I've talked to a lot of people and a lot of them have this. Oftentimes, like we think we've got like all sorts of different subconscious fears that, play a role into our behaviors, how we feel, our emotions, all these different things. And things aren't as always clear as I might be, articulating them out to be. So I think the big part of it is just like surrendering to yourself, like saying, hey, dude, like you've gotten to a point where your life has gotten this far. And a lot of the times this comes when something bad happens, right? You get like that alarm clock, you get that wake up call. We're like, oh shit, like I gotta re-examine here. I've got to take stock. So I think the first thing is just to like take stock, like get out a piece of paper and like write down, like, what are my main problems in my life? Like, what are the things that I wake up every day and I hate doing? Mm-hmm. Like, what are my biggest fears? Like, do I hate waking up at 6 a.m.? And then you got to like dig deeper, right? It's like, oh, do I hate to wake up at 6 a.m. or do I hate to wake up at 6 a.m. because I have work? Or is it, do I hate to wake up at 6 a.m. because I have work? Because there's like a couple people there that I hate talking to, because whenever I'm around them, I have like this emotionally negative feeling. And then you just have to like keep digging deeper and deeper. And it's like this, man. Like, I'm not even a big fan of following advice, but the one advice that I will say is like, once you remove the BS from your life, you will start telling yourself what to do. Like, you'll start figuring out, like, in a very natural way, oh, I guess I should start doing that thing. Oh, I guess I should start doing that thing. Mm-hmm. And it just becomes like this like unwinding process of yourself. And that's how I think it starts.
Yeah, no. And I think, you know, you're bang on there. It requires, I think, someone to be brutally honest with themselves. You know, I think, you know, again, like I can imagine a lot of people, you know, you might say like, well, you know, there might be a lot of things that you want in your life, but you're embarrassed to admit. I think, as you're kind of getting to, you're embarrassed to admit it to yourself, right? Because it sounds greedy. You have to say like, well, hey, I want a lot of money. Well, no, you know, that's a shallow thing to want in life. So no, you know, and you won't tell yourself that. But if that's what you want, if that's what your ambition is, then that's what you want. You have to be brutally honest with yourself. And you know, what you said at the top of that is of the progress that we have made as humans, is very, I think, core to what I want people to sort of recognize. Because I think what happens is, you know, we normalize our existence very quickly, right? Like, and there's what you would love if you haven't seen it is it's like maybe about 5-minute little video by a gentleman named Hans Rosling. Hanz, I think. And he was a statistician. And what he did, if you look up Hans Rosling, health versus wealth. Have you ever seen this, right? Yeah. So he's got this amazing video where what he does is he takes like an enormous number of data points over the last 200 years from all the nations, health and wealth as those two sort of data points, but like lots and lots of it. And he points and then he visualizes what's happened over the last 200 years. And if you go back 200 years, what you'll see is only the Dutch and the English were up in that healthy, wealthy quadrant. Everybody else, as you were kind of saying, was down in the poor, third world, you know, poor and sick quadrant. And if you look over time, you know, you see all of these nations starting to move a clear path towards everybody moving towards that health and wealth. You see what the impact of individual wars, how all of a sudden, you know, like everybody's kind of going up. Oh, Second World War, you know, oh, all right, we're going up again, right? So I think it's important, again, you know, for people to recognize how good we have it, you know, because this is the other thing too that, you know, that worries me sometimes is that, you know, what we live through. I really do feel that maintaining what we have requires constant vigilance, absolute constant vigilance, because again, like I said, it becomes very easy to normalize what we have and then not think twice about it, not think about and I agree, and that's the thing, is not recognize the sacrifices that our forefathers and foremothers made for us to enjoy this. And you know what I've said a number of times is this: like, what you experience today is unusual. It is in fact freakish in the grand history of humanity. The normal human experience is death, disease, famine, and war, not what you experience today. And you have a lot of people to thank, you know, forefathers to thank for that. And don't treat it lightly, because it can be lost in a day, in an hour.
Yeah, man. Like I literally wake up every day and I'm like, holy shit. Every single thing that I see around me has been made by people that come before me. Right. And I'm not even talking about physically. I'm talking about ideas, themes, truths, love, all these different concepts that have been distilled down from human culture and race. Like, there's been so much blood, disease. And like, I look around and I'm like, there were literally billions of people that died to bring this into fruition. Yeah. And, you know, I think in terms of that kind of society, I think it comes down to two groups of people really that are both very much needed: conformists and nonconformists. So I think you need conformists to like uphold the status quo, to make sure that things are moving on a, you know, sustainable, linear, steady basis. But at the same time, you also need nonconformists, right? Because it's kind of like this, like in the 1960s, 1950s, you could say like, hey, the famine disease, like we're all good, right? But then black people are still being slaves.
Oh, yeah.
It's like you need a nonconformist like Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, like some of these people to say, hey guys, all this stuff is awesome and cool, but we also need to like look at that thing. And I think that's just going to keep on happening. I think society is just going to keep on evolving that way as it has been.
Yeah. No, you're right. I agree with you that you always need sort of agitators. But right now, this is my issue, and I think maybe you would agree with me, is that there is an agitation of well, hey, what we everything's shit, right? It's all shit. It's all this, again, as we were talking about, the sort of patriarchal system. Let's tear the whole thing down.
Yeah.
And it's very dangerous thinking as far as I'm concerned. And it's very we're back to the gentleman. He's a Canadian. From the University of Toronto, which is where I live, and we actually, here in Ontario, exactly, like this all started from him pushing back on a law that they passed here in Ontario, right, where they started to compel speech, right, like you have to, and again, I don't want to get into the politics of that either, but at the end of the day, it boils down to a pushback against groupthink, right? And which is it's so dangerous, right? Like that is what has happened historically when we allow ourselves to think in that way. Like this is the thing, is like what I would not tear down is this idea of like individual rights and freedoms. What America is based on is the Renaissance of the realizations. And was it perfect from day one? No, of course not. Of course not. Was slavery terrible? Absolutely, it was terrible. Of course it was, but guess what? America was also one of the first nations to outlaw slavery, right? It's not, and we haven't been doing this for that long. Yeah. Right. And at least they wrote, the Constitution and everything that states that every man, and this is the thing is and this is another point that Jordan Peterson made during a monk debate that I watched of him, right? It's like it's not just about individual rights and freedoms. It also comes down to individual responsibility, right? Yeah. And so like, how do you hold a group responsible? How do you hold a group accountable? And it's just very dangerous, unhealthy thinking as far as I'm concerned. So I agree that you need the agitators, but be wary of, be wary. Like the agitators are like, show me the better future. Okay, yeah. I'm willing to listen to your message. You're telling me that everything's like all the things, the problems, and who's all and all negative, and do this group thing. I'm not interested in your agitation as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, for sure. And dude, what I think that comes down to? I think it comes down to the whole kind of victim mentality. Yes, that's true. Yeah, because like, dude, like I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. Very, very liberal, completely democratic states, man. Dude, all the public schools, man, the environment is the same. It's all this whole kind of same of like, oh, this Trump did this, and then now we're this, and now we're like collectivized into this group, and now we're victims, and now we can't do anything until they change. Right. So it's kind of like this whole kind of like shifting of responsibility, because responsibility is hard to embrace if you've never done it already. So I think it's like kind of like this distortion of like this whole kind of groupthink that allows people to escape responsibility. And it's kind of like the government, right? It's kind of like this political system that we've created. It's like this, hey, if we have a president that's, or a prime minister in your case, that's there for 4 years, hey, after 4 years, it's the other dude's fault. And then after 4 years, it's the other dude's fault. Right. And it's like this whole system where like we just let awful things happen without anybody or anything taking responsibility, Yeah. And so I think it comes down to like this whole victim responsibility, which is kind of like the opposite of individualism, right? It's kind of like the opposite. It is the opposite of individualism, and that's where I have an issue.
Yeah, for sure. And I couldn't agree more, man. And I think, and like, I talk to young kids about this too. And like, I talk to a lot of young kids and they'll say to me like, oh, Mark, why does the world suck? Why is the world so bad? And like, you realize like in their classrooms, whether it's from like their awful English teacher that's like divorced, that's on like 2 different medications, that hates their life, and they come in and they just start like spewing this crap on these kids, and then they pick it up, and then like they don't have a good environment at home, and just like perpetuates like this constant cycle of like despair and doom, and like just no gratitude, like no understanding of like what we actually have today.
Yeah,
You
no,
know?
gratitude's
And like,
so key. We've talked a lot about that, right? It's how key that is, right? Be grateful.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's the key to, I mean, maybe this is the funny thing, is I kind of feel at the moment, and it's just because of the times that we live in, it's almost sort of part of my mission, is to heal the wounds of this polarized world. They're exactly what you're getting on. It's polarized. And again, so again, it goes back to what we're saying about, you know, recognizing how good it is. Be grateful for what we have. But you also touched on something that's very key there, is recognize how it works. Progress has always been serpentine. The pendulum has always shifted from one side to the left. Don't get so hung up on, you know, Hillary's my girl, Trump is my guy. None of these people are your guy. None of them are my guy. You know why? Because they're politicians. Politicians are narcissists by nature, right? They're never your guy. They're always operating on 4-year cycles. Mm-hmm. Right? They're not looking for your long-term interest. It's, you know, and you know, I think it was Winston Churchill who had the great quote, right? Like, democracy is the worst form of government except in comparison to all others. Right? Yeah. Like, you know, same thing, you know, our legal system, you know, it's, you know, there isn't great justice, but compared to, you know, dictatorship, much better. Yeah. You know, like, we're doing the best we can. You like recognize the common ground that we have. Here's the core sort of, I think, part of that message too. And I think here's the thing. I think we have, when you say like, what does that better future look like? Then we kind of talk, then everybody's sort of on the same page, right? I don't know anybody who's like for poverty. I don't know anybody who's for racism and discrimination. Yeah. I don't know anybody who's for sexism. People want everybody wants a more tolerant, more prosperous, equal world. Mm-hmm. So it's the outcome that we're ultimately all going for is roughly similar. It's just the path that we vary on. And allow, you know, sort of submit yourself to the collective wisdom of the group. Allow yourself to sort of, you know, to the fact that, you know, when the pendulum shifts to one extreme, we recognize the folly of that extreme, and sometimes it needs to be pushed back. And when it gets pushed back, yeah, it's probably equally flawed. But if you look again, as we were saying before, over the course of time, the result of that has been serpentine progress.
Yeah, and I think this is what everyone listening, I think this is the ultimate point that I think people should know, right? If you see something out there in the world that you don't like, that you have a problem for, then fix it. Like, dedicate your life to it, right? Like, there's a difference between, for example, like somebody that, you know, takes a look at the environment, takes a look at pollution, and they're like, I don't like that. I don't like that problem. Like, we've got to fix this whole climate control, right? There's a big difference between, like, you know, going out there in like a 1-day protest that's gonna, like, you know, you're gonna like the government's like state house, and you're gonna like protest, you and like 30 other people, like this bill. Or you could literally dedicate your entire life to solving the climate by like starting a startup or by making an organization. But here's the thing though, people don't often do that. They'll just go with the protest because there isn't that much responsibility in there. There isn't that much respect. There isn't that much effort in there. And that's what I think the main thing is. So I think the way that we really change this world is by everyone tripling down on themselves. Not necessarily like, you know, surrender into the collective good, but like triple down on yourself, figure out who you are, find a problem in the world, and just triple down on it. Like for example, like if you kind of go at the beginning, the question you asked me at the party, like I chose virtual and augmented reality because I think that it's going to fundamentally disrupt everything we do. And today it's being used in to solve solutions or to solve issues.
Just getting started.
Exactly. So I'm like, hey, this is really important to me. I'm going to triple down, and this is going to be my life for the next 10, 15 years, right? This isn't me like saying like, oh, I'm going to donate like $5 to this thing. I'm going to do this. No, I'm going to like triple down and like really hone in on focus. And like when you do that, the world, other people around you start to open themselves in new ways that you've never seen before, you know, which my business led to my podcast and led to this and that.
Yeah.
So it's
I think you just, sorry to interrupt, but I think you just hit on the nail on the head, right? You invested in something constructive. I think that is the key. It's like, whatever your problem is that you're trying to fix, that's great. But exactly, talk to me about solutions. Don't talk to me about what you're angry about. Talk to me about what you're going to do. Stop talking about, if you don't like that there's poor people, sometimes when again, people are talking about that, but what I hear is, you just hate the rich. Don't tell me about what you hate. Tell me about what you're going to fix, right? If you really care about the poor people, then tell me what you're doing for them. Don't tell me about complain about the 1%. Because they didn't do anything. They're not sitting on their balconies with rifles shooting poor people. Right? Which is sort of the characterization that again, and it's really like to me now, it's like I can tell whether the person has the right mindset or not in a second. It's right. Like, are they hating on something, or are they talking about solutions?
Positivity, negativity. Man.
Yeah, positive, negative, and it's like you just smell it in a second, and it's like, and I just have no time for the negative, right?
Yeah. Sure. And dude, one thing I want to say is that so I'm talking to this lady later today. She's a pretty famous author. Her name is Loretta Guzina. She's the founder of the Mammal Institute. And she kind of takes a biological look to like the way our feelings are interacting with the modern world. And I haven't read this book, but it's called Political Correctness. Okay. And it's basically this: when people are on Facebook and they're getting in like really hot, like heated arguments about like, oh, Trump and Clinton or Trudeau or whoever and this bill and that bill, the same chemicals that get released when you emotionally really care about someone, they also get released in an argument. So I think we're living in like the most, not confusing, but the most misconfused time in human history, where things are kind of moving, but everyone's really confused about the way that things are actually happening. Like somebody watching the news, for example, and sees 6 mass shootings, when in reality, like their brain would never, ever, ever see that in reality. And that kind of violence has been decreasing ever since.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that is a big problem with media today, unfortunately, is that exactly. And it's become such a sort of entertainment industry. So they're looking for the provocative. They're looking for all of this sort of salacious, and hyping all the negative up. When in fact, as you pointed out, violence has gone down globally. Tribalism has been reduced. Famine has been reduced. But exactly, they love to focus on the negative because it gets more ratings, unfortunately. And it's you got to exactly that people have to tune that out. So we've gone really meta here, but so let's pull it back a little bit so that I'm keeping something sort of within the mandate of the show here. And you had a great you as I said, you speaking to people like Neil Patel, Seth Godin. What have you learned in order to make your podcast and your ventures successful? How have you learned to market and sell yourself that has been effective for you?
Yeah.
And obviously, what I'll just sort of to sort of segue that is mindset, clearly, and these attitudes are a big factor of that. I think you would agree, right? And that's like, if anything, you probably attribute almost 90% of it to that, right?
Of course. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about that other 10%.
Yeah. I mean, so I started the Humans 2.0 podcast of this time last year. So August of 2017. And I really didn't take it seriously. Like I'd post like once every 2 weeks. Sometimes I'd post like 2 in a day. Like it was just all over the place. And then like at the end of that year, so I was doing it for like not even 4 months. So I maybe had like 10, 15 episodes out. And, you know, I really started to see some traction. I really started to see some sort of, you know, I don't want to say this, but as a born entrepreneur, you can kind of like sense opportunities. You know what I mean? So I kind of like had that thing going. And I'm like, oh, what's going on? So then I was like this, you know, I've detected some opportunities just by the time I've like half-assed this podcast thing. So I might as well like triple down on it. So like at the beginning of this year, January 1st, I was like, I got to go all out. So I basically started posting like, I started off like posting 5 interviews a week, but then now I've brought it down to like 3 interviews, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Right. And then like ever since I started doing that, people actually started listening to the podcast. Up to then, it'd get like 20 downloads, right? But then 3 months of like posting very consistently, people actually started listening to it. And then through then I just started to get like, you know, feedback over time, what people wanted to see, what people didn't want to see, who people wanted to see, the kinds of people that wanted to see. And then in maybe like March, that's when I started to get on like a little bit more high profile guests. People like Neil Patel, Jay Samit, David Meltzer, people that are just like, you know, I read their stuff, I read their books, and I'm like, holy shit. So I started doing that, and then basically like a lot of people started listening to the podcast. I started using LinkedIn, like in the middle of March or at the end of March consistently. And I really built my podcast off the backbone of LinkedIn and through consistent posting. And then in June, I'm like, yo, this podcasting thing, holy shit, I need to triple down even more, right? Because that same entrepreneurial opportunity, you know, that thing in me is buzzing. It knows what's going on. So then I'm like, all right, this is going to be a daily podcast. So it's been a daily podcast. And I mean, right now, like things have been kind of batshit crazy. Like we're sitting here, August 20th. Just a few days ago, my podcast hit a top 100 in the entire world, above like people like Gary Vee, Tim Ferriss. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, like the thing is that it's not like a stable like ranking or anything. It's very like algorithm dependent, and it doesn't really mean much, to be honest with you. But it's just like a cool thing to say. You know, it's like a cool thing to say. Oh, I had that, you know, top 100 or whatever on this date. But like really ever since I've been doing that, and I really care, right? Like I see a lot of podcasters that like they're like they do everything right. Like they try to like they get on like the high profile guests, so like their podcast SEO can rank high. They get on other podcasters so their thing can start cross promoting. But it's like a lot of them just don't give a shit. Like they're doing this to get clients. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's like this. I can go on a podcast and instantly tell, you know, are you about to ask me like 10 questions that you've had and you aren't even listening to my answer, and you're not even making for a dynamic conversation, and like you're just trying to get out of the way? Or are you like trying to have like a real conversation, like kind of like what you and I are doing? And like eventually over time, people pick that up.
Absolutely.
So like just doing things like that, people noticing, and like let me just take a step back here. So I start this podcast when I like have a bunch of issues in my life, like when I've kind of discovered the whole mindset and I've made the fundamental like flip of the switch in my life. But I'm like, you know, it's a struggle, right? It's a struggle because like you're always trying to level up. You're trying to reverse the bad habits. You're trying to keep up the good habits. So I'm kind of there. It's kind of like a bloodbath, but it's like an amazing, blissful bloodbath in a sense. So I'm like, the whole kind of like going back to this, like the beginning and me talking about surrendering. I'm like, yo, I'm like this 20-year-old. I need to surrender, but in a way that's good. So I'm like, I need to start talking to people that actually know what they're doing. You know, like I need to actually get out there and like talk to people that are talking the talk, walking the walk. And that's fundamentally, exponentially accelerated my own learning, my own mindset, all that stuff, because I see and I talk to all these people firsthand.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like been the evolution of the podcast. But I would say like overall, one of the biggest things that I've learned is like this, like Neil Patel, Jay Samit, the Seth Godin, all these crazy high up people, they've all got insecurities. They've all got doubts. They all fear failure, all of them.
They're all
like
humans. They all take shits.
Exactly. And like before, at least, I didn't get that. Like I thought it was like, oh, once you get to this point, then like you make it like on this level, but not really. Right. And like just like having like a one-to-one experience with these people has like really taught me in my mind, like, oh, it's a good thing to fail. Oh, it's totally normal thing to be insecure and to be doubtful and to be this. And like, I think the success of my podcast has been kind of the evolution of people seeing my own evolution in a way, in a sense.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think you are an outstanding inspiration for people, for your generation, for a younger generation. One in part because you're just open and honest about it. You allow yourself to be vulnerable. You tell people the way it is. I think your show is amazing exactly because of exactly what you were saying there, is that you allow it to be a conversation. And that's what I certainly, from the get-go of my show, I was like, I didn't want to set a whole bunch of interview. Okay, now I'm going to ask this, now I'm going to ask. Like, I didn't want that. I wanted it to be a conversation because, as I've said many times, you know, a good conversation is like a journey. And then if you achieve that, then that's got to be entertaining, because then the viewer gets to kind of come along for the ride of that journey.
Right.
You know, I only started my show back in April. Yeah, basically, yeah, April. I think I had the good fortune of, again, roughly around the same time that you went on LinkedIn, and that's when I went on LinkedIn, and so immediately realized sort of same thing. I was like, oh, okay, like, and you know, LinkedIn has kind of had this bit of I've noticed a little bit. You know, I think that's sort of the epicenter of this movement of meaning that I've been talking about. So again, anybody who hears this, I encourage you, get on there, see what Mark is doing, see what I'm doing, see what a whole bunch of other people are doing on there, because it's not just a job site anymore. It is a growth platform, not just for your careers, but for your lives. And I think it's an amazing, wonderful thing. And again, like, I just think what you're doing, your show is outstanding. I think your message is such a good, positive one. Like I said off the top of the show, you know, for a guy who's only 21, you're wise beyond your years. I think your career is just going to be outstanding. You know, like I said, you know, if I could take a time machine and take just a few nuggets of what you've taught me, that would have probably changed the course of my life. So I imagine somebody who's your age, who's you know, struggling with their direction and so on, take the time to listen to Mark's show. You'll get a lot out of it. Any last sort of words of wisdom, tips for the audience here?
Yeah. Actually, you know, there's like the standard quote that's like, we're all gonna die. But I honestly think that may or may not be the case anymore, depending on how the future goes. But it's kind of like this, like I remember the main thing that was holding me back was kind of like everything in my head, like my emotions, my feelings, all based on like how others perceive me. And, you know, if you know you're going to die sometime, could be today, could be tomorrow, could be 20 years from now, you're really not going to give a shit what people thought about you or what your brain thinks about what other people are thinking about. It's going to think about what you really want to do, you know? So it's like, if I were to do anything in the world, you know, where I wasn't afraid, what would I do? That's what you got to start asking yourself, and that's what you got to start aligning yourself with. I
agree. That's a great advice. Exactly. You know, think about, you know, how would you live your life if you knew you only had a week to live? What would you do to make it count? You know, exactly. And what, I mean, man, at 21, like most people, you know, are older than myself when they start thinking about their legacy. And, you know, I think we can all leave one behind. So that's amazing. Mark, man, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Dude, thank you so much for having me on, Julian. Man, it was a really, really, really pleasure. I had a lot of fun. You're good at this.
I've got big